Good afternoon, everyone. As we wait for people to connect, I want to thank you for joining us for a very timely discussion on the war with Iran, which began nearly 3 weeks ago. I'm Kathy Manning. I am honored to serve as the board chair of Democratic Majority for Israel at this critical time. Since February 28th, the U.S. and Israel have continued to damage Iran's ballistic missiles and nuclear infrastructure, while Israel has targeted top figures in the Iranian regime. Meanwhile, in response to Hezbollah's heavy bombardment of Israel, Israel has intensified its offensive in Lebanon. As the war expands, critical questions remain regarding the long-term strategic outcome and the risks involved. Before we get started, a reminder to please consider following us on social media. We are on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. You can sign up for our news and updates on our website, dmfi.org. If you want to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. If you're watching on Facebook, you can enter it in the comments section. Now, I'm so pleased to introduce our very distinguished speakers for today. David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and the director of the Correct Project on Arab-Israel Relations. David previously worked in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He is also a former executive editor of the Jerusalem Post and an award-winning journalist who covered the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. He also recently launched season 6 of his podcast, Decision Points, which tackles the toughest foreign policy debates. We are so pleased to welcome back David. I'm also delighted to introduce retired IDF Colonel Miri. She is a senior fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University in Israel. She brings over 2 decades of experience in Israeli military intelligence, where she held senior leadership roles and was the first woman to serve in several of those roles, including as the deputy head of the Combat Intelligence Corps. Following her military service, she served as a spokesperson for the Israeli government during the 2006 Lebanon War, and later as international press secretary to Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Today, she is a widely respected analyst and frequent commentator on global security and Middle East affairs, appearing on major international media outlets. Welcome, David and Miri. David, why don't you start us off with your observations on the U.S. and Israeli military intervention in Iran, and then we'll turn to Miri.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and all of you. It's great to be with DMFI again. So thank you very much for having me. Look, I think it's important to just say from the outset that Iran has been considered a threat on both sides of the aisle, to both sides, Democrats, Republicans, for the 47 years of the Islamic Republic. It's been viewed as a destabilizing force in the Middle East. That has been the view of certainly of Arab states as well in the region, and by Israel, the fear of their illicit nuclear program, the missile and drones, their support for terrorism, their support for proxy groups, and an atrocious human rights record, whether the number is 32,000 killed in January 8th to 10th. This is considered the worst massacre in Iranian modern history by Iranian experts. So this is a regime, I think, whose isolation has deepened more than it would have imagined. At the start, I think it would face a UN vote of 135 countries against Iran. And it has been weakened. It has been by the 15,000 targeted hits by the U.S. and Israel. Israel focusing more on leadership targets, focusing certainly on the missiles and drones, and trying to hit the IRGC and Basij. That's the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and the Basij that are the kind of the repressive backbone of the regime. And the United States is also focused on the military industrial base where the drones and the ballistic missiles are focused, but it's been focusing a lot in the South. If I had to sum up in week 3 here, I would say that the the two countries are very much focused on, have different points of emphasis. Whether they're on the same page in terms of objectives, I think is we could argue it, but certainly with Israel focusing on the leadership targets and the IRGC and besiege, and the U.S. seeing this issue defined more in terms of oil, and that the Straits of Hormuz are the chokehold of the world economy. I think, ironically, for the American public, the Straits of Hormuz is something Americans intuitively get, that should not be, the people that have that chokehold should not be a radical regime. They understand that probably better than they understand. They don't know what the besiege is. They don't know what the IRGC is. They might not know a lot of the elements of Iran's regime, but this they very much understand. Now, does that mean that the U.S. and Israel will have a common sense of where the war ends? I think even Prime Minister Netanyahu has backed off a bit from talking about regime change. He's talking about creating the conditions for it happening down the road. I think the president, very unfortunately, is not willing to articulate or allow his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to articulate the goals of the attack. And I think that's hurt a lot. Is that because the president likes the limelight himself? Is it more because I think he doesn't want too strict of a definition of success, because he feels people will hold him to that, and he wants the room to maneuver to define whatever the outcome is as a political success? We don't know exactly. I think the fact that these is looking like two different wars almost. I'm not even getting into Lebanon, which I hope in the Q&A people will ask me, because I have things to say there too. But certainly on the Iran front, the double-edged sword is the short term. The American public can judge the success of the war by the pain at the pump, because they see gas prices going up. But I think what the president has to count on is that few Americans want to see this war end with Iran's, hand on that trigger of the chokehold on the world economy. So where does that leave us? If regime change, if it's more about regime weakening than it is about the regime collapse, I would say, look, we always have to be humble, because we don't know for sure. And we don't know if this ends with a mediated end, where, Russia ships out all of the Iranian nuclear stockpile, or it just ends that Trump says it's over. It's one of those two. But I think we do have to remind ourselves that Iran has no answer to the economic grievances of its public. And it will have even less answers with less, because with less resources, it doesn't have a military industry left anymore. If it's going to invest there, it's not investing in its own people. If it wants to rebuild, reconstitute its capabilities, it doesn't have an answer when it comes to water, electricity, the Iranian currency. All of those things Iran doesn't have an answer for. The world is short in knowing when there's going to be a regime collapse. No one predicted exactly when the Soviet Union would collapse. No one predicted when Mubarak's Egypt would collapse. No one predicted exactly when Assad's Syria will collapse. But we do know a weakened regime, when it's hollowed out, is not long for this world. So I'm not going to be the one to predict when it goes, but I do think it's important. And I think, look at some of the things that Anwar Gargash, the right hand of the head of the UAE, has said about, basically he's made clear that the approach of the Gulf states of just, sitting on the fence and hoping to accommodate itself to Iran, that strategy has just failed. And he says you'll see the Gulf states and Israel moving closer. Now we'll see how the war ends. There's going to be differences. We know, I'm not here to make this sound like it's going to be a honeymoon, but I think I think Gargash's comments to the Council of Foreign Relations, which were reported in the Times of Israel, are very important. And I'll just end on an American front here. Like I said, it pains me. I wish the president was able to make the argument in a more persuasive way. Yes, he's done much better with the Republicans. All this report that the MAGA people have left him doesn't seem to be true. The numbers of the Republicans are strong, but not with the rest of the country. And I think he would do much better in getting out there, getting people like Rubio out there to make the case. Why now? It happened. Why now? Because, he himself said help is on the way after 32,000 people have been massacred. Why now? Because the idea of the ballistic missiles, that after the 12 days war, people thought it was such a huge blow. They have learned to improvise. And clearly, when the president meets with the new, with the head of China, Xi, he's going to talk to Xi about, the chemicals for ballistic missiles from China. And why now? Because after the 12 days war, for all of its successes, the 400-kilogram of nuclear stockpile is still hidden beneath Isfahan, Fordow, and Natanz. So I think there's critiques that could be made on this war. I think there's no question. But I think we just shouldn't forget that the issue of Iran as a destabilizing force in the Middle East has always been a bipartisan concern. And it's something that we've seen now that the Arab states feel with increasing sense of concern, that they thought by sitting it out, they bought themselves immunity. And then what they found was that was not the case, and that approach was bankrupt. So anyway, I look forward to the discussion. I always enjoy hearing what Miri has to say, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, David. Miri, over to you.
Well, first of all, good evening, and thank you for inviting me. I'm sitting right now next to Tel Aviv in my city, and hopefully all of you listening to us right now will not hear an alert or a siren, and I'll be able to both talk and enjoy the discussion. It's been a busy day in that sense. What you see from here is not what you see from there. I'm inside a country that has been through the last 2.5 years of war, and there's over 90% support for what's happening right now. 90%. Can you think of anything that has 90% support inside the United States? And we're talking about a war that nobody's enjoying. We're sleepless, we're zombie-ish. This is not sitting around and being happy. Don't go after the pictures of the bomb shelter with the parties. I'd rather have a party in a bomb shelter than cry, but that doesn't mean it's a happy place. And you're talking to somebody who walks to the bomb shelter and back several times a day. Why is there such consensus, and why do we understand this war in a very different way than the way in the United States? Element number one. In Israel, for us, this is the main aspect of the war that for us started on October 7th. When Hamas attacked us, when Hezbollah joined in, when the Houthis attacked us, when the Shiites from Syria attacked us, when the Shiites from Iraq attacked us, when Iran attacked us, both in April and October of 2024, remember all of that war that everybody kind of goes, at the end for Israel, it always was, not that Iran was always pulling all the strings, but as David said before, Iran, the Islamic regime, this isn't the Persian people, are the ones who, the ideology, the supplying of the weapons, the training, their prize pupil, Hezbollah, that on March 2nd in this campaign chose Iran, the Islamic regime, over Lebanon, the country that they live in. And that's after Lebanon, the country that they live in, the Lebanese government, the Lebanese public said, don't join in, and Hezbollah joined in. So here we are right now, after we're on the end of the 19th day in that sense, into those 3 weeks. And from the Israeli perspective, the military goals are very clear. We don't talk here about the regime change in the way that I've seen it being discussed in North American media. Here we talk about the whole list of targets, and everybody goes, didn't you do it in the 12 days? And I'm like, you really aren't military people, and you really look at it like you can just demolish everything in 12 days and it's all gone. The Islamic regime invested 47 years in building nuclear capabilities that were attacked in the 12 days, and many of them were very diminished, but not all of them were destroyed. In addition to that, they invested an enormous amount in platforms. That's not just missiles and drones, it's the warheads themselves. Israel is sitting here being attacked by cluster bombs. These cluster bombs are coming in warheads that can be 10.5 warheads, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones that have all sorts of different payloads. Not only is Israel attacking, we could talk about the Gulf separately, but when we talk about what we're attacking in that sense and why we started, joint. It's a joint operation, Israel-US. It's not Israel and the US joint. It's not the US and Israel joint. It was a joint planned operation from the start. It was a separation of where Israel has the advantage, where the United States has the advantage. For us, it's also 1,000 miles away. For you, it's on the other side of the world, but it isn't that we border it. And in a moment, I'll talk about what we border, because we do border Lebanon, and Hezbollah joined in on March 2nd. But when we talk about the targets themselves, it can be the nuclear, it can be the missiles, it can be the launchers, it can be the facilities that make the missiles, the launchers, the drones. It can be the R&D facilities that are making space weapons that this Islamic regime have been developing for 47 years. And I very much agree with what David said before, that they've invested in this and not in their own economy. And their people are saying, why aren't you investing in our economy? And the big question, why now in that sense, is because Iran was very much attacked in June of last year, and that was for us the changing of the rules. And I say it from the bottom of my kishkas, okay? Israel's policy changed after October 7th. Israel said all of these different forces that are being built up by the Islamic regime in Iran, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, in Iraq, Iraqi Hezbollah, in Yemen, the Houthis, and I could go around other places in the world that we don't like talking about. The fact that they're building them up as a rogue state in that destabilizing, in that terror aspect, enough of the Islamic regime defining the rules of the game. We need to take them off balance. We need to be the ones who define the rules of the game. And I think that that started already in 2024 when Israel went on the initiative against Hezbollah in the first campaign until the ceasefire of November 2024. It continued with the very large-scale operation that took place in June of 2025, which was against those nuclear capabilities. Do any of you want to see this Islamic regime with any kind of nuclear capabilities? And it's continuing now. I cannot say anything about politicians. I can talk about military, and I'm going to avoid the issue of the politicians, but I want you to think about that. For a moment, ignore the politicians. And I say that because a politician is going to say, we won, we destroyed, we finished. And a military person will talk about the diminishing, the degrading, because you're not doing absolute. And I'm going to give now the two examples, both of Iran and of Hezbollah. Because what Israel did against Hezbollah in 2024 degraded and diminished Hezbollah's capabilities. So everybody's going, so why are you doing it again? A, because they chose to attack. And B, because in that diminishing and degrading of the military terror capabilities that Hezbollah has held, all of them, because of the Islamic regime, supplied by the Islamic regime, paid for by the Islamic regime. And I'm adding something else just right now, that from the ceasefire, November 2024, and until right now in February 28th, in the year that passed, the Islamic regime wanted to resupply Hezbollah with more weapons, with more drones, with more missiles, with everything that they had used. And they couldn't. And they couldn't because there was regime change, both in Syria and in Lebanon, meaning Israel's military operation against Hezbollah in 2024. And that's a military operation. And there's nothing nice about war anywhere. But that military operation brought, both in a direct way and in an indirect way, two regime changes. First Syria, then Lebanon, and those two new regimes, I don't have a lot to say about them as a Jew or as a Zionist, and I'm a Jew, an Israeli, and a Zionist, but they hate the Islamic regime of Iran and Hezbollah more than they hate Israel, both in Syria and in Lebanon. And when Israel diminished and degraded Hezbollah, Hezbollah was at the lowest, weakest point that it has been pretty much since its establishment. And what Iran did in the year that passed since that ceasefire, when they could not bring in the weapons because Syria closed down the door, because Lebanon closed down the door, because Israel was trying to stop them from bringing in the weapons, what did the Islamic regime of Iran do? They brought money. And they gave $1 billion. And that's $1 billion that they haven't put into their own country again. When we look back at what's been happening domestically in Iran, with everything going on, no water, no electricity, the country is falling apart. They took $1 billion to give to their proxy Hezbollah. So one of the targets that Israel has been targeting in Lebanon specifically, Hezbollah, has been the Hezbollah banks. So that it's not just the money flow, it's also who gets paid. So I went off, I'm going to come back. That targeting that I said, I want to be systematic. The nuclear, the weapons, the missiles, the launchers, they've had a lot of years. People are always like, how long can this go on? And I hate to say this, I'm the one who's sitting inside Israel. But after 3 weeks, you haven't taken out all of the launchers, but you've taken out a lot of them. So instead of firing 20 or 40 or 60 missiles, they can only fire one at a time, two at a time. Every time that they fire them, I am sure that we are hunting those missile launchers. But aside from the launchers, you're going after the arsenals of weapons, against the drones, against all the different capabilities. And yes, Israel has been targeting from the beginning of this campaign in a very systematic way the leadership of the Islamic regime, Khamenei from the beginning, on that opening stage, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and all the different forces that are the domestic forces that were the ones, can I use the word, oppressing the Iranian people for so many years. And that means attacking the police stations and the different, it's like, and that's, yes, that's part of the campaign, but from the Israeli perspective, that's part of it. That main aspect is still going against all of the physical elements that both Iran holds and held. And as soon as Hezbollah joined in, it's doing it to Hezbollah. Hezbollah, we degraded pretty much 70%. I'm giving as a number. That's what the IDF put out at the time when the ceasefire was signed in November 2024. But that means that 30% is left. For a moment, and I know statistics are not what you want to talk about right now, but that 30% that was left is twice the amount of weaponry that Hamas had on October 7th when they attacked. That was what was left to Hezbollah. And the type of weaponry that the Islamic regime of Iran had directly supplied to Hezbollah in Lebanon is qualitative edge type things, including, for example, very exact ATMs, advanced different types of anti-tank missiles. And those ones, from March 2nd, Hezbollah has been trying to use against Israel's northern border. And as I sit here right now, alerts coming in from the north. Hezbollah is trying to make the north an area that you can't live in. And what Israel said, I said, we're changing the rules of the game. We don't up and evacuate our own people. We will go into Lebanon, into those areas where Hezbollah is firing those direct attacks against Israeli communities, and we're going to get those weapons. We said in advance that we were going to do that. We told the villagers to leave. Villages and towns and cities, oh my God, hundreds of thousands of people have left in Lebanon. So you can look at it at the two sides. You want to read the Lebanese, it's about refugees. Can I give you the other side? We're telling people to leave because we're coming in. We want to save their lives. We're going to go in. We're going to get to the weapons that the Lebanese armed forces, UNIFIL, the worst, I'm not going to go down that road right now, had not done before. So I give you that new idea. This is a difference in policy of Israel. It is a clear one. It is against the terror military targets of the terror regime. And yes, I know that sounds like, a cliche, but it's a terror rogue regime of the Islamic regime. And Hezbollah is a terror army. And I think in that sense that for Israel, it's very clear what we're doing. Does that mean I know when it ends? No. It means that there's a very long list of targets that you can still do for weeks. But if you finish next week, you finish next week. In the meantime, you're going through that list of targets. Any diminishing, any degrading of the Islamic regime and the further degrading of Hezbollah is the best thing that can happen to the country called Lebanon and hopefully for the people in Iran. For me as an Israeli, that doesn't resolve it. I absolutely understand that. But to not touch it is yet again to say that you're not going after what we've always called the head of the snake. And I'm not a far right winger. And in Israel, again, I want to remind you, over 90% of the population, and believe you me, we are just as polarized as you are on every single subject you can think. And when it comes to this one, we're actually all on board. We see this as hard, as hurting. It hurts us. We do not have an economy. You can't go to work. The schools are not open. It's everything. It's very hard, and let alone the sirens and the alerts and the sleeplessness. But we want to take care of it. And the last point is in the joint. This is a joint event. I'm a military person. I've been a military person my entire life. The Israeli military has never done a joint. And I say that because this is quite can I do my tfu tfu tfu, knock on wood, okay? Oh my God, look at this joint operation in the sense of looking at the targets, dividing the targets between them, working together in the offense, in the defense, defending in all of the different ways. And this is something that is joint. It is a very strong, I think that like CENTCOM and the armed forces of the United States and Israel right now have the closest relationship you can imagine. There you don't see the gap. Is there a gap? Oh, yes. We can talk about the gap because the gap at the end, I just said, well, how clear it is for Israelis. And I go, you know what? You're on the other side of the world. Why did, and I say at the end, I wish I can't make, I'm not the 51st state in Israel. And I think that for me, Miri, for me sitting in Israel, the threat that the Islamic regime posed through what it has been doing for the last 47 years is something that was just sitting there and sitting there and sitting there and sitting there. And at the end, you get to the stage where you go, because everybody wants to know why now. Can I ask you all a question? Why not now? You want to wait longer? You want to wait until they do have the nuclear? You want to wait until they supply their proxies with that? And they supplied the proxies with everything else. Why not with that? Do you want to wait until and then everybody says, but now you've pushed them into the corner. I'm going, why do they get to define the rules of the game? Why do you want them to be the ones? And again, my whole life, I say, I don't want war. But I sometimes think that that necessary action of the why now, that combination of what was happening inside Iran, of the weakness that happened after we attacked Hezbollah, after we attacked Iran, and showed that you could do that, it's to further weaken them so that they're not the ones defining the Middle East, the destabilizing of the Middle East, the rogue country around the world. I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, Miri. You've given us a real picture of what's going on in Israel and how you see things so differently and how the Israelis are seeing things so differently. So thank you for that. Before I have two questions to ask before I turn it over to Rachel to open up the other questions. And I do want to say, David, that there are condolences to you in the chat for the loss of your father. We discussed it before we opened the webinar, but I just want people to understand that you've had a terrible loss, and our hearts go out to you. So let me ask first about the comments that have been coming out of the Gulf states, that they want to see this war through to the end so that Iran can no longer be a threat to its Arab neighbors. Is this surprising to see this development, and how do you think that's going to impact the way these countries interact with each other, with Israel, and will this impact the willingness of the U.S. to stay in this war longer? David, you want to take that first?
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Look, and thank you for the kind words about my dad. I appreciate it. I would say, look, the following, that when I was referring to Anwar Gargash, the top advisor of the UAE, and he basically saying, look, you know, this is not going to heal so easily between the Gulf states and Iran. And people are going to see how valuable Israel is. And as one Emirati said to me, a senior one, he said, we will never forget how, you know, we can't really talk about this in the media about how Israel has come to our defense, but that's what it is. And we're not going to forget that. Now, every Gulf state is different. And so I don't want to say the Gulf, because each one has their own strategy. It's clear. I think with the Emirates, it's a strategic relationship for both the U.S. and Israel and the Emirates. But I think all of these Gulf states have realized that by believing they could accommodate themselves to Iran, which I think began in 2019 after in the Trump administration, there was an attack on a Saudi facility of Aramco with one of the top production facilities, and the U.S. didn't respond. I think I had certainly Gulf people said, David, you want to know why we're accommodating ourselves to the Iranians? Because the U.S. didn't come to our defense. And if they're not going to come to the defense of Aramco, which is such a huge production facility, they're not going to help us. So I think that the strategy of the last 7 years basically has been bankrupt. That it just, you know, believing that if, you know, you don't get angry with the Iranians will leave you alone. No, the Iranians will not leave you alone. And so we're still in the middle of this. It's hard to know for sure. You know, there's going to be complications like this thing on the, you know, the oil field yesterday. Israel said that it consulted with the Trump administration. I think the blowback from the Gulf was not a good one, and Trump himself distanced himself. But I have no doubt that Israel, coordinated this with CENTCOM and also with the White House. Trump and Bibi speak daily, so there's going to be hiccups here, and how it ends is important. But it has to end. I'm sorry about keeping coming back to the Straits of Hormuz, but I think it's related to how the Gulf Israel thing comes. Look, the UN Security Council basically has got to come together, I think, and say that the Straits of Hormuz is an international waterway, and it will not allow any one regime to kind of hold it hostage, hold the world by the neck. And if anyone feels this no less than the US is China, because it's completely dependent on oil coming out of the Straits of Hormuz. So if the end of this ends with that Iran does not have that chokehold, and I don't see how this war ends with Iran having that chokehold, then I think there has to be clear rules of the game, because the Gulf needs that waterway to be protected. It's got to be the US, it's got to be other allies who join in and make that possible. I do think you'll see the US, Israel and the Gulf, I should say, getting closer as a result. And again, each country might be different with the Saudi normalization. We'll have to see how the Israeli election plays out because of provisions in that Saudi normalization deal, as we all know, dealing with the Palestinian issue. But I think in the big picture, people realize that you cannot rely on Iran. I mean, Iran was firing rockets at Qatar that was trying to mediate this and has been one of the countries closest.
And Oman.
And I was just about to say Oman, and even fired at Turkey, which has also stood up for the Iranians. So, I mean, like, the three countries that have been closest to the Iranians are the ones that have also felt the attack. None of this to take away from the Emirates, which is in terms of ballistic missiles and drones, I think it faced 3 times what Israel has faced because they have more.
Yeah, I have the exact data. It's immense.
It's shocking. So to me, it's unthinkable that this thing ends with these countries believing that they could trust Iran somehow to just like wipe the slate clean. I just don't see it. I think there's no other country. Also, these countries are going to rely on, they're not going to rely on China. It doesn't have an alliance system for their security. So both, Kathy, to your question, in terms of Gulf US relations, I think those ties will get closer. And I think the US is, I mean, in the Gulf, Israel should be closer, but it has to end, with a clear victory at the Straits of Hormuz that Iran cannot have that chokehold. If it ends in a stalemate that Iran does have that chokehold, then I am concerned how the Gulf reacts in the short term. It's not like they'll embrace Iran, but there'll be more wariness all around. So I think how this ends is crucial. But as one senior Gulf official said to me, he said, David, just know one thing. All of us are in this now, but don't stop midway, because we don't want an angry Iran with all this capability.
Right.
And I do think that is something that they don't give press conferences about and shout it from the rooftops on CNN. But I do think that is there, is that these Gulf states want Israel and the United States as the leader to keep pressing forward.
They're certainly not going to shout it on CNN. But let me turn to Miri, because you've talked about the joint operations, that this was planned in a coordinated way between the US and Israel before things started. It wasn't so long ago that Israel was in the European command, and Israel was then moved into CENTCOM. Do you think that has had a major impact in allowing this close strategic relationship that really wouldn't have been possible had responsibility for Israel not moved into U.S. Central Command?
It's a fascinating aspect, and I absolutely think that it assisted. It's not the only thing. One of the things that always is different, as I say, from my military perspective, is that over the last 25 years, under all of the different administrations, and I want to remind you, over 25 years, you've had enough administrations, okay? POTUS of this one and that one and that one. I have seen, and it didn't matter Republican or Democrat, every single one of those administrations, you've seen a trajectory of a closer, more intimate relationship between the militaries of the two countries. It's a language, it's shared values, it's shared threats, it's looking at the world in a similar way. And I think that from the military perspective, and that's why when I say that for Israelis, when we talk about that, this whole portion right now of this horrific war is more clear to us, is because a lot of us, look at the world through that. The transfer from EUCOM to CENTCOM, and I want to remind everybody, we're not members of NATO. Turkey is, okay? We're observers, and Turkey has made a lot of problems for our observer status, even inside NATO right now. I'm just talking about the military aspect. But being in CENTCOM mean that from the decision maker, you're inside the same arena. I have to say something totally not connected for you to understand how important it is. In COVID, I discovered that Israel is not in the Middle East in the World Health Organization. The Eastern Mediterranean is from Morocco through Afghanistan. I kid you not. Okay? And Israel is not in it. We're in Europe. And I say that because it's one of those things where our being at the time, we're not the 51st state, but being in CENTCOM means that the same joint leadership of the military that's meeting with the Jordanians or with the Egyptians, with the Emiratis or with the Sauds, with the Kuwaitis, with the Qataris, you have bases all over the place, okay? You don't have bases in Israel, even though now you have a little bit of a base in Israel where the International Stabilization Force and that command post, which is in Kiryat Gat, looking at the Gaza Strip, that also made a difference because suddenly it's something where you have common language, common people. When we're talking about a joint operation, that capability of military commanders to talk to each other, to understand each other, this is something that I've seen throughout the last 2.5 years. I think that the ceasefire, still under the Biden administration, that was done for Israel, Lebanon, and with Hezbollah had to do again with that cooperation with the military and having a military person in Lebanon, and that's going to be American, and then somebody here, and we know how to talk the same language. So that's definitely of importance. It doesn't have to do with, the relationship between politicians, because I saw within, in that sense, people always wonder, both about the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu and what happens when you had a change of administration, okay? And when we have elections at the end of this year, and I don't know. And as I always say, I think that military security relationship is always there in the background, and it's managed to surpass any of the changes in administration. It's a very basic relationship.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Rachel for the questions that we have in the chat, David, I want you to comment on one more thing. We are hearing reports that Russia is providing intelligence to Iran in terms of targeting. And can you talk about what does that portend? I mean, having Russia providing targets to Iran, how do we see that impacting the war effort, impacting the U.S. involvement, and impacting the relationship with Russia going forward?
Yeah, I think good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. I mean, some of this might be classified. I think though, whatever they're giving to Iran, I think for Iran, it's not enough because Iran is pretty much isolated. No one is really fighting with them. Zelensky says, the president of Ukraine, that they are giving them these Shahed drones and that he's going to help the US and Israel with counter-drone technology, where apparently the Ukrainians have become world leaders because they've had to deal with so many Russian drones. And look, clearly Russia has benefited by the oil sanctions move because Trump has been so worried about the price of oil going up. He did a couple things that last Friday, I believe, simultaneously. He released what's called the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, got other countries to release part of their reserve. But in so doing, he also exempted, I think, Iran from Russian oil for sanctions, which angered the Germans and other Europeans who were trying to, keep, of course, Russia's oil under sanctions. But Trump is worried about the price of oil. So I think Russia's been a beneficiary, you could say, in a certain way at the margins. But I think for Iran, it's small comfort because in the big picture, it has not eased their isolation, not with 135 countries at the UN. All the Arab states basically furious at them because they're lashing out in every which direction, and no one is coming really, to fight alongside Iran the way the U.S. and Israel are fighting with each other, not the Russians and not the Chinese. So I think this war has really exposed Iran's isolation, and they're their own worst enemies. They didn't have to hit 11 countries the way they've done. So, I think they've played a bad hand pretty poorly in this regard.
Thank you. All right.
Hey, I mean, I think you're feeling sorry for them at the end, don't?
No, I'm not feeling sorry for them, but it's a stunning, Miri, a stunning miscalculation on their point. It might point to like when they don't have leadership, that it's like a chicken with the head cut off kind of thing, but it has not helped them at all.
I have many more questions, but we have lots and lots of questions in the chat. So I'm going to turn things over to Rachel. And let me just, as I talked to you both about before the call, there are many people who are asking, why can't we get Democrats to understand the importance of this war? And you did both talk about why now, and that was very helpful. But Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much. And if folks have questions, you can put it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I'm going to start off with a question from Lisa addressed to both of you, David and Miri. She thanks you very much for your analysis. Can you both address the disconnect of the U.S. and Israel fighting a joint, well-coordinated operation, but having potentially different war goals and, at least in the case of the U.S., not having a clear articulation of the war goals and the end game? And what are the implications on timing, strategy, and narrative, and therefore public support for the war? Miri, do you want to begin?
I'll jump in and then I'm going to let David go because I think, again, that it's easier for me as an Israeli. I think that the best way to address this question to Lisa and to all of the people listening in on right now is to do something which for me is easy because I'm a military person. You have to separate the military aims, which are very clear, from the political echelon. Really, I'm going to even say, talk. I say for a moment, I like close my ears. I know that right now, as I'm sitting here right now, and happily in this conversation, I'm not listening to the Israeli Prime Minister who's talking in Israel right now. And I say that not because it doesn't matter if I support or I'm against him right now. I'll listen afterwards to what he has to say. Why does that matter to what you just asked right now? Because in endgame, when you start an operation, you start a war, and Israel and the US jointly started an operation against the Islamic regime. And in the joint communique that they put out at the beginning, it's very clear. I'm saying militarily. I know the targets. I understand why those targets. I understand why now. Why do I not see an end date? Because that already has to do with how Iran responded and what we're doing now. I was not surprised by Iran's response, okay? But in that sense that they decided to drag everybody in. Because why did they decide to drag everybody in from my perspective? That's called the Islamic regime's dirty rules of the game. I'll attack everybody. They'll all come to the United States and say, you got to stop, because our economies are tanking. And I totally understand them. Their economies are tanking, going against the oil, the gas, the tourism, the sense of safety. Every single one of those countries there, they've lived through in the last 3 weeks something that I'm living through, and it's horrible. So when I look at it in that sense of the end game, to me, it's a diminished, degraded Iran. Does it mean regime change? And I'm saying that from the Israeli perspective. Not necessarily. But all I want right now is in that diminished thing, and I think David said this at the beginning, is that in its rebuilding itself after this is over, and it can be over next week or in 2 weeks with those military targets, okay? When this is over, and again, I'm saying from the Israeli perspective, this isn't taking enough into account what is so central, which is the Straits of Hormuz, I admit, okay? And I realize how important that is. But when I look at it from that Islamic regime point of view, I want to see if the regime the day after, okay, decides to put the next $1 billion into resupplying a Hezbollah and into rebuilding its own outside that, nuclear and different capabilities, or is it going to sit and say, okay, they always talk about the fact that they have 6,000 years to do things. 6,000 years, okay, so in another 100 years, they'll go back and try and do something else. It's about the priorities. And so for me right now, I don't expect to suddenly see, certainly not democracy. That's never been the terms that I've looked at. But it's to see a regime that is not focused in its ideological main aspect on the annihilation of the state of Israel. Or as they would put it, hi, I'm the cancer tumor in the world, cut me out, and then the world is a better place. And I'm using exact quotes from Khamenei, and I'm sure we'll hear that from his son as well. So that end game, give it another week, that's more degrading, that's more diminishing. When it comes to the Hormuz Strait, we're the secondary partner, meaning Israel now has started to do some attacks in the south, but it was pretty much we were doing the north and the west, and the United States was doing the south. It's almost what you could call in military terms, splitting up the arenas. And I don't see us being directly involved there in the same way. For that, we take the cue from the United States. And again, I so understand, how do you say Mitsuka? The
Yeah.
Mitsuka,
Predicament.
the predicament, okay? And I understand that. And yet here I am saying right now from my Israeli perspective, this predicament is one that you could say, let's put it off, and then they get to define the date when it happens. It would have happened as far as I'm concerned in any case. Their chokehold, the targets that they used, everything that they're doing is what they were going to do. And I prefer it to be with the initiative of the United States and Israel and changing the rules of the game than in the Islamic regime using all of the proxies and doing it on their own. I'm not sure I really answered the question.
Can I try a little bit, Rach? Look,
Please.
for the United States, again, I mean, the middle, as I say, and I'm not contradicting Miri here at all. I mean, I see the battlefield successes as completely necessary. To me, the world without that is going to be a chaotic Middle East where the Gulf states cannot export their oil. The world economy will suffer. It is critical that this war end in a way that is viewed as a defeat for Iran in this regard, and that the world economy can proceed apace. But it's sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You're going to have to keep the pressure on. You're going to have to talk to the Chinese, for example, not to give chemicals that they've been supplying to reconstitute their ballistic missiles. And I was in Israel and I got a briefing along with my colleague Dennis Ross on a very high level. And he said, look, David, they've been very they've improvised. They have a phrase in Hebrew called iltur, to improvise. They're great at improvising. They have an industrial base, but the Chinese have been importing key chemicals in this regard. When Trump sits down with the leader of China, this has to be a key issue, that they cannot reconstitute their ballistic missiles. I also think we have to keep putting the pressure on what's going on in the Iranian economy. When the president of Iran, when he dealt with all these grievances, now there's no electricity, there's not water, the currency is just falling off a cliff. And he says, well, maybe we could do $7 a month. Okay, now $7 a month is not going to solve the Iranian problems, and now they don't have a defense industry. To reconstitute is so much harder. That means they have to devote more and more of less and less into that. And that means certainly no answer for the economic grievances of their own people. So I truly believe that, keep the pressure on them. Am I here to predict that within 18 months of this, the Iranian government will be gone? I'm not going to predict that, but all I know is when these regimes weaken and they can't answer the economic grievances of their own people, they're in a world of hurt, and I wouldn't want to be in their position. That's not that I feel sorry for them, Miri. I'm just saying that the key is not just the war ending. The key is using that as the first floor of an edifice where you work the China angle, you work the Straits of Hormuz angle with the Gulf states in the Security Council, you work a lot of different things to keep the heat on Iran and also what they're doing to their own people. People said, with all this weakening, why aren't people going to the streets? I asked an Iranian American who's really in touch, really with a finger on the pulse, and I asked her yesterday. She said, David, all I know is I call people over there, and they'll say outside of my home in Iran, there is the besieged still has their weapons. Maybe their office has been bombed by Israel, but they're living in a tent or they're living in a truck outside the home. And so we've seen the brutality of this regime that could slaughter thousands. So people yet aren't coming. But when this government has no answer for their people, I do think their future is not bright.
Thank you. David, I'm going to go to you again with the next question, and maybe our final question as we're heading towards the top of the hour. David, we saw this week that the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, resigned. And in his resignation letter, he said that Israel effectively pulled the United States into this conflict. In your view, how should we understand the decision to go to war, how President Trump decided to go to war?
Look, my understanding is that ultimately he has a very strong relationship with General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He listens to him a lot. Under him, there's the whole CENTCOM structure with Admiral Cooper. And my understanding is the White House has an excellent relationship with him, too. He clearly hears different things, maybe from Secretary of State Rubio and from Vice President Vance. The relationship with the Secretary of Defense is unclear to me. But I do think that a lot of them did rally behind this. The idea that somehow Israel is going to be able to like hold the U.S. by the nose, I think is ridiculous, given how strong our institutions are. And what I said at the outset, how this has been a threat that has bedeviled Democrats and Republicans alike. And certainly it was Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, who came out with the Carter Doctrine, and not allowing a hostile power to gain control of the Straits of Hormuz. So I really think it's horrible that using anti-Semitic tropes and linking things to saying that Israel led to the Iraq War. Everyone knows in 2003, Israel thought then that Iran was a bigger threat than Iraq. Everybody knows that. So, I mean, this is somebody, I don't know how this guy got into government, but I think I'd really like to, use your question, Rachel. I really hope that this president, once this war is over, I mean, I would like him to make the case to the public. I feel he hasn't done it because he doesn't want to get held to an objective, and he wants to be able to always claim victory. But I think after this war is over, he has to face down what I would call the Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owen wing of this party, which is not as strong as some of the people in the media want to make it out, because we've seen among Republican voters how the support for this war is huge. But only the president can make the case, like he did to the Atlantic magazine on the first day of the Iran of the 12-day war. He said, like, who are they? They're not MAGA. I invented MAGA. And I think only the president can do that. And I hope he faces them down. And also, look, I'll use this moment. I'm concerned. I'm speaking among friends here. I'm very concerned of what I call the horseshoe politics, Rachel, of American politics, where kind of the hard right and the hard left, they have not converged. They have different critiques, of course, but they are not that far apart. And, when there's a prominent person in the Democratic Party that says, if you're supportive of this effort, I don't want you in this party. Does anyone believe that Democrats can win an election if they actively tell a sizable minority of the party, I don't want your vote? I mean, to me, it's shocking. And I just think the passion of critique against the war, and I understand it about the War Powers Act, I completely get that. And I think it's a valid critique in many ways. But that same sort of righteous indignation should also talk about how Iran is destabilizing this region and the world economy, and Israel too, and the Gulf states. I just feel that, we in America, we need a very vibrant two-party system. And we saw after the Vietnam situation that the Democrats didn't come back to power for a generation because of worrying about on foreign policy that oh, we don't want to touch anything that sounds interventionist. And the American public didn't trust the Democrats for a generation. Are we going back to that? I don't think that's the party I know. And so I hope there'll be other voices that will stand up to people calling for a small tent. And it's been very upsetting. So I'm worried about both sides of the aisle, and I'm hoping that you know, Kathy and Rachel, you know me so well, that you know I always go to sports analogies, and in sports analogies I worry about the end zone people, the people at the end, you know, at the fringes of the debate. I really believe the mainstream in this country, on either side of the 50-yard line, you know, right of center, left of center, from the 30 to the 30. I believe that's the majority of this country, and I hope that those people assert themselves against these fringes. Against, I'm sorry for the mixed metaphors of the end zones of the horseshoe that I really worry about for the future of our country. So I'm sorry for that, but I want to thank you again for allowing me to come on it, and for what you said about the kind words about the podcast Decision Points. And we're going to be discussing some of these tough issues and on Twitter and other social media platforms. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, David. We'll be listening. Miri, do you have any closing thoughts for 30 seconds or so before we hand it over to Brian Romick?
30 seconds. I want everybody to notice that it's a war, it's harsh, but look at Lebanon, look at Syria, look at the changes that are happening. The Middle East is changing, and yes, it's because of military prowess, but that doesn't always mean negative. Sometimes it brings about real changes, and I really think we need to take note of that.
Thank you so much, Miri. I know it's late there. I'm glad you're safe, and we're grateful to have you with us. Thank you, David, and I'm happy to hand it over to Brian Romick, our President and CEO.
Thank you, Rachel. Also, thank you, David and Miri. I did want to flag in the chat, someone was asking about what we're doing to try to change the narrative and improve the American public's perception of the war. I think to start with, we were working a lot on Capitol Hill, sending out talking points, memos, that sort of thing. We even sent out a week ago, and I think most of you probably got it, quotes from about 20 House and Senate Democrats talking about how positive it was that the Iranian weapons were degraded, nuclear, ballistic, and that sort of thing. And if you go to our website, DMFI.org, there's I think it's Rachel messaging and reports. You can see both talking points and memos laying out the case for why this is helpful, why this is important to do, and you should share them with your friends. You should review them. And, you know, we're continuing to try to put stuff out and influence the debate. We're very active on social media as well. So anyway, in closing, once again, I want to thank David and Miri for joining us today. We appreciate the perspectives and insights because this is obviously a complex moment. And with the news in Iran and the region, there's no shortage of issues shaping our key priorities. In this environment, DMFI will continue to operate with focus and purpose, educating policymakers, bolstering pro-Israel leadership in the Democratic Party, and reinforcing bipartisan support for the U.S.'s relationship. Along with the board and staff, we're seeking to grow DMFI to meet this important and challenging time. We cannot do this alone. We rely entirely on the generosity of individual supporters. Your contributions to DMFI enable us to address the challenges in front of us and those that lie ahead. You can scan the QR code on your screen or go to DMFI.org to make a gift. Thank you in advance, and I hope to see you again on our next webinar. And if you like the reports we're putting out, if you like what we're doing on social media, please donate. We want to be able to do more of it. We want to be more active. We want to be more engaged in the debate and the discussion. So thank you very much.
Very much.